Well, thanks for coming to the session. I think it's a testament to the popularity of Spark that we not only have a big following in industry, we also have a pretty big following in a slightly different institute. So let me just introduce the people who work with me. We have a large group of people who would call themselves behavioral economists, and that's me here. We are working with a group of computer scientists. So that's the team. I mentioned this is a different kind of organization, so I will speak just a few words about the organization. If you look at our URL, we end with .gov, and for most of the people who are in the US, you will recognize this is US government-controlled institutions. However, we do have a very great view on the Berkeley Hill. For those of the people who might recognize, this is UC Berkeley's Campanile, and this is the famous Golden Gate Bridge. It may not be very clear, but it's actually there, so trust me. And that, of course, is San Francisco from Berkeley Hill. What we are is we are one of the national labs that's run by U.S. Department of Energy, and we are U.S. Department of Energy is the largest funding source for physical science research. If you want to know more detail, then we can definitely talk. And I should also mention that this afternoon in this room, the first speaker, Dr. Wang Zhong, is also from this institution. Okay? And so our tagline is bring science solution to the world. And we essentially do physical science. We mostly do physical science. And this particular research is related to energy policy. This is where consumer behavior comes into the play from the policy angle. So, getting down to more specifically this topic that I'm talking about, behavioral analysis. So I want to start with a basic question. I guess I was going to do this as a question, but I took out all the animations. So the basic question is, you probably heard of Wealth of Nations, and the same author actually produced another book a couple of decades earlier called Theory of Moral Sentiment. Okay? He was actually attempting to do behavioral economy study before he attempted to do a more, what we now call a more traditional economics study. Now, what's the difference here? So, if you follow the Wealth of Nations, you're basically following this line of thought, and the people in the economic theory would call this Homo economicus. Okay, so your basic assumption is there is a set of theory and a set of equations, and you can follow, and from those equations you can do computations, and you can make decisions rationally. The reason it works is once you have an equation, you have some amount of data, then you can make predictions. And that has been reasonably helpful because we have proof that the world economy is actually running quite reasonably well. So that's mostly based on this line of thinking. So as we collect more data and getting more computer power, we're starting to realize that the Homo economicus is not really Homo sapiens. Well, it's even not, less likely to be Homo sapiens. So the idea is you need to measure a lot more and then do predictions based on real measurements. Okay? So that's the basic background of behavioral economics. So you need to actually study people and do predictions. To get to the even more specific things of this energy policy study, and the biggest story that I can think of is this particular blackout on East Coast. Actually, East Coast. I think it might even affect this area. This is from 2003. What happened is there was an outage in a fairly small area, but what happened was that small outage caused a certain amount of electricity not to be available, and that reduced the supply. Okay, so we're talking about demand of electricity and supply of electricity, and that reduced the supply just by a little bit, and that happened to cause the supply overall in this wide area to be less than the demand, and that one caused a big problem that triggered a huge outage in this huge area going from Michigan all the way to Canada. Okay, so when electricity demand outstrips supply, you have a huge problem. Okay, I was going to say, how it's related to how it compares with blackjack. In blackjack, if you go over 21, then you bust. So that's a problem. So we have a similar problem there, and this particular problem, as people become wealthier and buy more air conditioning and all those things, so they use more electricity. So that actually becomes a bigger problem. And the other reason this has become a bigger problem in the future likely is because there are more demands the more supply that are going to be irregular. So like wind energy. I don't know if anyone from Texas. Texas is the biggest wind energy in the U.S. Has the biggest wind energy supply in the U.S. If you have a lot of wind energy, then the wind suddenly died down, and you might have this situation where your demand is more than your supply. So, and you don't want that to cause a big blackout in your state, right? So, are there things we can do to make sure when the demand is high, there is some way to encourage people to not use as much? Okay, so that's this study is about. So I'm going to gradually dive into more and more specific things. So this is a more specific thing of how to reduce the peak energy demand. And as I said, we're not just going to do this based on theory. We're going to do this based on actual observation of user behavior. Okay, so this is the residential electricity measurement on smart meters. And it's a fairly large number of households involved. This is the real data. This also has some restrictions that I'll mention. So one thing that's important to mention is this region where this is from a region where the usage during the summer afternoon is the peak hour. So the goal is actually to reduce the peak hour during summer afternoon. And this is to say there's a well-designed, controlled trial for the experiment. So the experiment actually lasts 3 years. 1 year before the new pricing scheme is introduced, 2 years after the new pricing scheme. The year marked T is when the new pricing scheme is introduced, and T+1 is the second year. For those of you who are involved in this sort of study, doing predictions in fairly short term is relatively easy. Doing any sort of prediction over years, that's going to be something a lot harder. The other thing to say is in this whole process, the goal is to figure out whether having this new pricing scheme can reduce the peak time usage, right? So in order to do that, we have to have some sort of baseline. We have to have some comparison base point. So the first part of the work is going to be talking about what's the projection of this particular household that will use in, so we have measurement of this year. We want to predict how much the electricity will be used in the second year and in third year, right? So, and the prediction I mentioned, we are talking about peak hour usage. So let me just jump into here. We're talking about during the day and the peak hour usage. So we need to make predictions that are accurate to the hour but goes over for 2 years. So the other challenge here is that data is fairly noisy and irregular. The difference between the various groups, the control group and I should go back and explain what are those control groups and passive groups. So this is a randomized control experiment. So there's a control group, and those group of people are not told there is any change, and they are on the old pricing scheme. So there are 2 groups that are recruited to participate in this experiment. This particular experiment is based on the time of use policy, which means during these hours when electricity use is high, they will be charged more. Okay, so that's what time of use means. So there are 2 different groups here. One is called active group, one is called passive group. The active group people, the active group of people are sent a letter, and they send the letter back saying, I want to participate in this. And the passive group is sent a letter to say, you are enrolled in this particular experiment. If you want to get out, send a letter back to us. We'll get you out. So that's the difference between active and passive. You can imagine the active group are the people who probably have good appliances who they can turn off, or they have newer appliances that use less energy, right? So the behavior would be different. The point from here is that we have found a way to do this prediction that takes some work. I think maybe if you're interested in the technical detail, you can come and talk to me about the technical detail. But the point is we have figured out a way to do this sort of prediction. The solid line, so the dot, the plus and the triangles, those are the actual measurements. The lines was labeled LTAP, that's the actual, that's the prediction. The prediction is based on the old pricing scheme. So it's based on the data from year T-1, before the new price is introduced. So we would hope the prediction, the baseline, is higher than the actual measurement. Okay? So if you look at year T, which is the red line, versus the red plus, and you can see there is a difference. The red plus is below the red line. Okay? So that means they use less energy. And this is the passive group. You can actually see the number here. So because of these 2 groups, the passive group and active, they're told this is happening, so they use less energy. That's kind of understandable. So I mentioned that the active group probably would reduce the energy use more, and you can see they do reduce the energy use more. That makes sense. The control group uses more. This is actually because the temperature is higher in this year. The temperature is higher in year T versus in year T-1. So there is more usage. And this all makes sense. What starts to become a bit more interesting is the control group also reduced its energy use. And this is very much human behavior. The old approach, if you just use the control group as the base, then you will see because the control group has reduced its usage, the relative measure between the control group and the other groups would be smaller. And they were all puzzling about, speculating, the users may become lazy and, not paying as much attention to their energy use, to this time of use pricing policy. But what we see is, the user behavior is actually fairly stable. We speculate the control groups, the users who are not initially told there is this pricing of use policy, they heard from their neighbors or something, they got wind of this and they were thinking they should also reduce their energy use. So that's what's happening here. They did reduce their energy use. So point here is this particular study, what we're doing is we're establishing a baseline that's for each user, for each household. And this can be used to study individual household, while the previous, just the control group, that you can only do this for the group. And the group, because there are human beings involved, the groups could influence each other, while if we do a correct machine model, then we could possibly eliminate that human influence. So that's one type of study. And if you are looking at the numbers, you will notice that this number, 0.164 is relatively small compared to the actual usage, right? The actual usage is like 1.8, so this is less than 10%, even for the active group. And if you look at the passive group or the other group, that is even smaller, which means this pricing policy seems to have very little influence on the consumer behavior. Now, this is possibly because the consumer behavior, some of the group, electricity is not a really big thing in most of the US household, right? So you might pay, $50 or $100, while your other expenses are much more than that. $50 or $100 may be less than the dinner's cost, while, the other concerns are much bigger. So is there a different way to segment the consumers and figure out what would make more impact, right? So that's the other study that I'm going to talk about, that is how to segment the users and potentially find out if there are more users more amenable to this study, and therefore we can influence them more. So the idea is to look into different patterns of usage, right? So imagine you have a household that doesn't change, this is probably not very interesting. And if you have a household with, say, solar panels, during the daytime when there's sun, they use very little. So this is a different pattern. And you have people who are busy in the morning and not at home, and then come back in the evening. Anyway, there are different patterns that we can look at. The idea is, can we automatically discover these patterns? And this again is a task that we can give to Spark and use machine learning to do this. Actually, much simpler. You can do we're trying something simpler, clustering techniques. Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about. Can we use clustering techniques to figure this sort of thing out? The basic process, we need to do some data cleaning, like most of the data science. We need to do some sort of data cleaning. In this particular case, the data cleaning is very simple. What we do is we remove the households that use very little electricity, which means either they have a broken meter or no one is at home. So they're not interesting. The other thing is called, for this particular study, this is kind of interesting. That's why it's in red color. We remove the minimum usage from the data, which means the household always use at least that much energy, which means they're not changing, right? We're trying to figure out whether we can influence user behavior. That means if the electricity usage doesn't change, there's no way to influence that, right? So that's why we remove this minimum usage from the data. Then we normalize the data and so forth. Then we can go through the clustering study. Okay? So this clustering study. This clustering is a 24-dimensional data set. So it's a high dimension, but not particularly high. I mentioned, so let me just quickly go through the clustering techniques. I believe these are all the clustering techniques that are available that we could get our hands on last summer. That's when this study was done. So central-based schemes, that k-means and adaptive k-means and so forth. So then clustering, hierarchical clustering, we did density clustering, dB scan, which is very, very famous. Then we have a number of techniques based on variations of Gaussian mixture models. So now, we're going to produce lots of clusters, and we could not possibly get the behavioral economists to look at all the clusters. So we have to use some quantitative measures, and we don't know exactly which qualitative measure would be good. So we're kind of also just using a lot to do this. There are two basic measures of cluster quality: compactness and distinctness. And then there are techniques that mix both of those, that are hybrid. So I'm not going to talk about the details of the formulas, just to say that we studied this and we implemented this. So here's the result. Typically, we would expect some curve like this. Okay? As you get more clusters, the average cluster quality would improve, and all of the scores are designed in such a way that lower is better. Okay? So typically, you will get a curve that will go, as the number of clusters increase, you will go, this measure will go down. Okay? So it will be kind of like this. You probably would prefer a smooth curve, but we'll live with a jagged curve if we can get it. Now, there are a couple of curves that goes upward, and we really don't understand why they should be going upward. That probably has something to do with the data, and the data set is probably too noisy or not appropriate in this case. So, trying to come to a short conclusion out of this set of very messy curves, what we basically see is, in terms of compactness, the blue curves, okay, the blue ones are good, they're more compact, and the blue ones are the centroid-based methods. Distinctiveness, those hierarchical clusters, they do produce more distinct clusters, but we really don't understand why the distinctness is getting worse as you get more clusters. So we really don't know what's going on, and we don't trust that answer, right? That's what I'm putting this as puzzling. We see puzzling behavior, and if we want to give anybody advices, we don't want them to be using this set of methods. And we probably would suggest that you use one of the blue methods. Okay, so that's the short answer from this set of study. Obviously, this is not a very conclusive answer. We probably would much prefer to have some curve like this, right? You know, just blue curve way down below and nice and smooth. But that's not if you're going to use any measure other than this particular one, you're not going to get it. So there is another justification for saying that centroid-based methods actually probably should be preferred. The way to read this slide is to say, this is showing the size, but the size measured as the fraction of the total number of data points. Okay, so if you're getting more than 90% of your data in one cluster, that cluster probably is not useful because it's pretty much everything. And what you see is there are lots of methods with this very, very dark red, and then end up with blue at the end here. That means those methods are producing very, very imbalanced cluster. They basically throw pretty much everything into one cluster and leave the rest of the clusters only have a few entries, and that's not interesting. And so the k-means, k-meteors are better because the red is not particularly red, and you don't end up with blue. So they produce more balanced clusters. So that's the short answer from here. That's another way to say they probably produce more clusters that you're more interested in. So in conclusion, this is kind of preliminary. We don't have a really, really solid conclusion in this, but if you do want a really, really short answer that from this study is, centroid-based method for clustering for this type of data is good. If you want to dig into a little bit of detail, then the answer is complicated. If you have read this paper, then you might really dislike us. So come talk to us. So thank you for your attention, and I can answer a few questions if there's any.
Questions for John?
I would expect this is a very, very different kind of audience. Maybe the most impressive one I present is the first slide that my workplace has a great view of the Golden Gate Bridge.
Okay, great.
Oh, sorry.
So very interesting to see the behavioral analysis. What kind of features did you feed into the k-means in terms of identifying a person's behavior?
So we are simply using the hourly electricity measurement as the features. So there is not a lot of data preparation in this case. The actual data set do have more interesting features like survey results that with more detail. But at this point, we're trying to see whether we can have an easy way to classify the users, and apparently the easy way we can think of is not working out.
Thank you. Based on the clustering approach you took, feeding in the feature that you stated, what type of clusters were you actually getting?
We do have clusters that with, say, morning peaks, then afternoon peaks.
Okay, so your centroids are like based on,
yes,
on time. It's a function of time.
Because our features are essentially time series, so what the clusters would also be time series, and we can plot the time series and see the features. And they don't exactly reproduce this, but we do have patterns like this and this, and this. So those are fairly easy patterns to capture. They kind of make sense. Single peak, pretty dominant, pretty common. If you remember the average, so. This curve, this is average over all households. So this is a pretty common feature. I imagine if you take 90% of the household and average them, that's the centroid, right?
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Do you have a question? So there's someone. Oh, wait.
On the consumer behavior side, there's also an incentive that has to be qualified to make a difference, right? How do you test for that?
So in this particular case, the incentive is price of the electricity. So if you use more electricity, say during these hours, your electricity will be more expensive. And so there are actually, in this particular study, there are actually a couple of different pricing strategies, but for this, I'm only concentrating on one. And this one is just based on time of use. Every day in the summer, if you use electricity between 2 and 6, you're charged a different price, and higher price. So that's the incentive.
One more question? Two. Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering if you were able to identify any interesting clusters, like people that do home farming or things like that, based on your profiles?
So I think our data provider, I mentioned there's some privacy concerns. Our data provider probably was worried about that and did not want us to do that sort of things. So we're not doing anything like that. We're not trying to identify a particular household that maybe is doing something that will cause me to be kicked out of California.
Following up on that, the clustering thing.
Yeah.
So essentially, when you do something like k-means clustering or centroid clustering, it ends up making a lot of different clusters that wouldn't essentially make sense if you were to just look at it. So is there a way you could highlight what were the key features that led to that particular cluster? Essentially, when the feature set is like super diverse, is there something like that that you did along with this?
We're working with the behavior economists and trying to get them to tell us what the clusters mean. So they want something like this, but so far we haven't been able to really produce the clusters exactly to their liking. So they're continuing work in this front.
So essentially, you have an idea of what the cluster should look like. What my point was like, you get a cluster and then you find an inference what that cluster actually means. Is that so? That's the other way around. Is something like that?
So we are taking the approach you're suggesting. That is, we are just clustering the data and then ask them what the clusters mean. Right? So far, we have not got very many interesting ones. We got things like this and this and this, and they're obvious. It's obviously what they mean. This is kind of a typical behavior, and this is slightly delayed, and this has two peaks because people use electricity in the morning and in the evening. Right? So they're relatively straightforward explanations of what those clusters mean. What we're hoping is to get probably slightly more interesting ones, like that person is using electricity to farm in his own household. So.
Thanks.
Okay, one last question, I think.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I was wondering about the quality measures you had for your clusters. Which one did you end up using? And some of those need labeled data to measure the quality. Did you have labeled data at the end? How did you do this?
We don't have, for clustering, we don't have labeled data. We are using quality measures that do not require us to use labels. And the answer from here is to say it really depends on what you want to do, what you want to measure, and the clustering give you different answers.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and please show
Well,
your
maybe we should talk.
Yeah, take it offline, John. I think. Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.